Very much to Ellen and to all of you. I'm a journalist, which means that I'm in the bad news business. I like to say you'll never see a headline in a newspaper that says plane landed safely. We only write about plane crashes. But in this case, as this audience knows far better than I do, there's an awful lot of good news. I'm just going to run through some headlines that hit me as I was preparing for this. The cost of LED lights has dropped 90% since 2008. Large-scale solar costs have dropped by 60%. Wind and battery prices declined by over 40%. In terms of output since 2008, from 400,000 LED light bulbs to more than 78 million installed. Wind energy production has tripled. Solar has increased more than 20-fold. So I want to begin by asking Secretary Moniz how these remarkable things have happened and what role the programs that you have tried to focus on, in particular the ARPA-E program, how they've contributed to the development of these technologies commercially. Maybe you could begin by talking about what ARPA-E is in your mind, how it ought to work, the ways it's like and also different from DARPA and the other energy innovators.
David, let me actually start with a broader remark, and then I'll come down to ARPA-E. I think we should recognize that the United States has got really an unparalleled kind of innovation system. It's got with a lot of pieces. Clearly, first of all, we have, I would still say, the world's greatest university system, complemented by national laboratories, et cetera. But very important is that in our universities, speaking now maybe from my previous incarnation, we have been much more open for a long time with the idea that kind of the ivory tower interacts with the world. Certainly MIT was founded, in fact, it's not called university, it's called institute. It was founded with that as part of its DNA. But I think our American system does that. But then it's very important that we have a very active investor community that literally often has presence on campuses at small companies, at the spin-out companies, et cetera. And it's really this, it takes a complicated system, I think, that to have this all come together with the kinds of innovation that then drives the kinds of results that you talked about. And those cost reductions are really dramatic. I would also say that they are essential. Because in the end, I personally believe that it is continuing innovation, driving down costs, that will be at the foundation of our ability to address really some tough challenges like our climate goals. Now, ARPA-E was really put out there for the first time in a National Academy report. I think it was called Beyond the Gathering Storm, about a decade ago. And it certainly reinforced the importance of innovation and R&D in this space. But in particular, it took the example of DARPA and suggested that this office, ARPA-E, be created. And I think the distinguishing feature is, as with DARPA, a more nimble organization, and an organization that in so many ways revolves around its really smart and passionate program directors who really want to come in and get something done, whether it's in the battery space or in the vehicle space or whatever. Just as at DARPA, you had that kind of people coming in for a few years and pursuing that. There are other technical details like special authorities, but I think that's really the heart of it. And I think that it's proved its worth. I think yesterday, in fact, there were the announcements about now, in roughly the first 200 projects that are now finished, you have about a quarter of them with private sector funding, over $1 billion. You have about a quarter of them picked up by other agencies for going further, including DoD, and you have 36 companies coming out of this. So I would say that these are intermediate metrics of success. The real metric of success will be in another 5 or 10 years if they have scaled up and made a major change in our energy system.
I thought it might be useful if you just walked us through a couple of your real success stories. Maybe start with how to build a better battery with Fluidic, which I think is one of your ARPA-E companies. Maybe you could just describe how that technology works, how ARPA-E helped get it going, and where you see it now going commercially.
Well, okay, so there are lots and lots of stories, and by the way, later on, I'd like to take you down to the floor and see some of these technologies. Well, first of all, battery storage is a game changer once again when we get the cost down and can meet other performance metrics. This is a good example. A university professor, Arizona State, I believe, with a novel metal air battery structure that looks to be getting great cost reductions, in particular for grid scale storage. Hugely important problem. A second one I just mentioned, going back to my MIT days, now it's called 1366, a faculty member who I recruited to my initial Energy Initiative board, got an ARPA-E grant, and I lost him to good purpose in the sense that he invented for the second time in his career, big space in between, invented a novel manufacturing approach to solar wafers. And I have to say, I think he got follow-on funding from our renewable office and from our loan office, but this is a person, again, with passion. He took retirement to focus on building a company, and they are now building a factory in New York. And then a third example, I'll just give one that I think we couldn't call a success yet at that scale, but we'll see. Very interesting. Makani, which was then bought by Google, and Makani is kind of like a flying wind turbine, and the idea is to take advantage of the far superior winds at, say, 1,000 feet, and it kind of goes around up there. I'll tell you, Makani was very gracious, along with a few other technology providers, and they took their wing, their 8-meter wing, to Paris at the COP meeting, and it was a pretty big hit. Seeing this. Now, it wasn't flying around, but it was really terrific. And it is the kind of thing that could be, again, transformational. For one thing, maybe that's the solution ultimately to kind of deep offshore wind, as opposed to the structures, because a major part of this is they take like 90% of the weight out of the turbine. So anyway, it's just all kinds of different technologies, and it's really exciting stuff.
I'm sure one of the nice things about being energy secretary is you get to take, cool things along with you to international conferences and show them off. Let me ask you,
Can I add one more then?
Please.
Which is not ARPA-E, but our Oak Ridge laboratory. We also took along to Paris a 3D printed sports car, and it was a big hit.
So let me ask a sort of baseline question. In a world where there are thousands of people in the venture capital business, I'm sure some people wonder why we also need ARPA-E to provide government support for this research. And I'd be grateful just for your explanation of why the government side is important, and then maybe you could talk about how you move things from the government support level into being independently commercially financed.
Well, first I should say, of course, ARPA-E is a centerpiece of what we do, but there are other programs as well, from our science program to our applied energy programs to our loan program that all act at different stages of this chain. In fact, I just mentioned with the 1366 example, there were 3 different epochs just with DOE in that one example. ARPA-E, then the applied energy program picked it up, and then our loan program is now moved in to help with the debt financing for a new factory construction in New York State. So it's not just one thing. I want to emphasize that. The private sector and this linkage that we're always trying to improve with the private sector, I mean the government work and the private sector, is critical, but the private sector typically is not going to be investing in the research in a kind of a pre-competitive world. So that is certainly one unique role, I think, where the government, pretty much provides most of the support. But let me also just jump to the far other end of the spectrum in deployment. We have a loan program, and it's amazing how little you hear, I don't want to say the word Solyndra anymore, but the portfolio is extraordinarily successful, and what it's done is, if you take an example of utility scale photovoltaics, when the program really got into gear in 2009, we had no utility scale photovoltaics in the country. I'm saying like 100 megawatts and greater. The program provided debt financing, and of course 2009, 2010 was a particularly difficult time for debt financing. Debt financing for 5 projects, all successful. And now there are, I've lost count, 20 or 21 additional projects of that scale purely with private financing. So that's the idea, that also at that level, helping the deployment end works. In fact, it's kind of the virtuous cycle between innovation, technology innovation, and the deployment that A, there's a feedback, and B, that's what keeps driving the cost down. And we need more of it. I would just say as an aside, I was very, very pleased to see how the innovation agenda became so central in the discussions in Paris during COP21. I don't mean only the announcement of mission innovation, but the idea that innovation and cost reduction following from it would be critical to the increasing ambition on decarbonization that will be needed every 5 or 10 years as we go on. So I think it's really caught hold, and people are beginning to understand.
Maybe you could just take us, Mr. Secretary, through the mission innovation program that was announced in Paris at the end of November. As I understand it, it commits 20 countries to work together to double their clean energy output. And it's exciting to think about, but you also have to ask whether for all the countries involved, India, China, a number of countries are on that list, Brazil, whether those are really realistic targets and what that market is going to look like if you've got 20 countries chasing these same goals. What's that world going to look like?
Well, first of all, David, let me say it's 20 countries, all seeking to double their R&D in 5 years, but not working together. I want to emphasize that it's 20 countries make the commitment. I'll come back to your question, but it's important right now to say in parallel and developed together, but independent, is the Bill Gates-led Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which is now the investor side, with billions on the table to capture the fruits of this increased push on innovation. Now, when you talk about the 20 countries and all, quotes, pursuing the same goal, first of all, different countries will clearly have different portfolios. I'll take Saudi Arabia as an example. They made it very clear. Carbon management is likely to be their focus, very different from some other Germany, let's say. So there will be different portfolios. Secondly, I think one of the benefits for the world will be the build-up of innovation systems and hopefully entrepreneurial activity in many countries. I think that's clearly to the benefit of all. Third, let me emphasize, there are some very, very different scales in these 20 countries. The United States is, let's say, roughly half of the total. So our baseline is $6+ billion, and that's about half probably of the total. So we are still the big, we're the locomotive pulling the train. And frankly, with all these countries investing in innovation, and almost certainly with some additional country-to-country collaboration on specific projects, although not required, with that going on, frankly, we better stay out in front of the train. The global markets, the U.S. and global markets in clean energy technology have been growing rapidly. Now you've got 190 some countries in Paris saying we're all going to pursue some decently ambitious goal in decarbonization. Almost surely those markets are going to just now start taking off even more strongly. Trillions of dollars involved, and clearly, notice without even saying the word climate, this is an important investment for us to make. Now, with climate, I think it's a no-brainer, but...
The journalist in me is reminded that today is what we call Super Tuesday, which means that it's a big day politically, and that leads me to ask you a question that I think people around the world ask, which is how irreversible is the commitment that the United States made in Paris at the end of last year? Suppose we got a different presidential administration that had a very different goal, a very different conception of these energy and climate change issues. Are the commitments that you made ones that could be changed down the road? How would the mission innovation goals, for example, that you committed to be affected if we had different leadership?
Well, first of all, I think the innovation agenda really has very substantial bipartisan support. I had, you may think of today as an election day. I think of today as a hearing in the Congress day. That's what I did this morning, and with an appropriations committee. And look, clearly concerns were expressed by the chairman about how to make all the numbers add up. But I have to say the tone was pretty positive about the innovation agenda. In the Senate, Republican Lindsey Graham has organized a kind of an innovation caucus. So I think there's a lot of support for this agenda, and I think that's independent of the administration. Now, when it comes to regulatory approaches to climate, obviously then there's a bit more disagreement at the moment. But I would say a couple things. One is that because, frankly, we have been unable to get a statutory approach to climate, let's say an economy-wide approach to climate, a lot of the activities, in addition to technology development, have been in the rules and regulation arena. At DOE, for example, this last year we picked up the pace and we issued 13 final efficiency rules for appliances and equipment. We'll do the same this year, et cetera. Those, if one wanted to change those, one would have to go through a full rulemaking process. That was attempted once before at the change of administration, and it was lost in the courts. So so I think, we have laid an important groundwork, but I don't think I don't think the president would deny that in the end, we are going to need at some point an administration and a Congress to work together and to have an economy-wide approach to addressing climate.
But you feel confident that ARPA-E, which was an initiative, the initial planning was done under the George W. Bush administration, as I remember the history,
Yes.
that has enough bipartisan support that this audience can be confident that ARPA-E will be around regardless of what happens.
I certainly think so. Frankly, this morning in my hearing, the chairman in his discussion said, quote, "I like ARPA-E." So, I think no, because again, look, it's all going to clean energy, but first of all, it's very broad-based in its technologies. It's not doing just solar energy. Very, very broad set of activities, detecting methane leaks for oil production fields, et cetera, which is, of course, it's an important contribution to climate, but it's important also in the hydrocarbon industry. So it's a very broad agenda. That's one thing that's very important. But secondly, everybody likes innovation. And I think with the track record that's developing, 36 companies coming out of a couple of hundred projects, people see success, at least in that intermediate metric, as I say.
Looking at some numbers over the last few days, I noticed that the ARPA-E funding appropriation, I think, for the most recent fiscal year is about a tenth of what DARPA's is. That's roughly correct. So I wonder whether if you had more money to work with, you could achieve better results, whether it's frustrating to you looking at the range of projects that you could fund that you don't have more money.
First of all, the Department of Energy budget is about 1/20th of the Department of Defense budget. So there you go. By scaling, we're doing better. No, but you're certainly correct. Look, just last year, we had another what's called open solicitation for ARPA-E, and that was the third such solicitation, and which means any ideas are welcome. And in the end, I think it was just over 2% of the initial proposals could actually be funded. When you have a track record that I think ARPA-E has built up over these last 6 years, and you fund 2%, you got to think you're leaving an awful lot of innovation on the table. So I think we have a tremendous capacity to do more. The 2005 National Academy report suggested $1 billion a year. I think that could be well managed, and the administration budget request this year, in fact, would have the budget going up to $1 billion after 5 years. But again, we'll see this year what happens.
Talking to your counterparts, or the ARPA-E counterparts at DARPA and IARPA, I've heard people say, we want to fund projects that will fail fast if they're going to fail. In other words, we want to be careful not to extenuate the process and see what really works and then quickly move that towards commercialization. Is ARPA-E failing fast enough? How are you doing by that metric?
Maybe not well enough. I think the group really does extraordinary job in terms of how it does its due diligence on projects. This is not a hands-off kind of management. Well, I mean, the scientists do their science, but I think the program managers are heavily involved. I think if we weren't seeing more output in terms of how the private sector is coming in with funding, again, $1.25 billion for roughly a quarter of the projects that have been completed. I would worry more, but I like to see, I mean, ARPA-E should be taking risks, and I mean, flying wind turbines is a pretty good example, I would say, of doing that. But yeah, no, it's an issue. Yeah, it's an issue. So we have to guard against, getting too comfortable.
So I'm sure many people in this audience wonder, in an era of very low oil prices, what's going to happen to these innovative alternative energy projects that ARPA-E has been funding, that you focused on as secretary? What thoughts do you have for entrepreneurs out there who worry that these are not going to be economically viable until oil prices, energy prices go back up again? And just sort of what this market looks to you longer term as you think about the broad issue of energy innovation?
Well, look, so first of all, we clearly are playing the long game here when you're talking about R&D and technology. That may be little comfort to an investor in some cases, but we're clearly playing the long game, and there's no reason to think that history will not repeat itself in terms of boom and bust in terms of oil prices. Clearly, barring some major dislocation in the Middle East or somewhere, certainly all the fundamentals suggest that we will remain with, prices closer to what they are today than $120 for a while, just because of the overhang of the excess capacity and the excess, the huge storage that's going on. But having said that, if we talk about the United States, first of all, one might argue that in the energy system today, actually the low natural gas prices have maybe had a larger impact than the low oil prices. Certainly in the power sector, obviously, there's been an enormous switch from coal to gas, largely driven by the low gas price. A number of nuclear plants have closed down, largely in areas where the competition is tough in the face of the low gas prices. But nevertheless, in the electricity arena, renewables keep growing very, very fast. For one thing, look, we have a lot of states with renewable portfolio standards, et cetera. But we also have, as you said earlier, incredibly reduced costs for these technologies. And they just plain make sense in a lot of situations. On the oil side, clearly in the United States, we're talking essentially transportation fuels. There has been an impact, no doubt. Electric vehicle sales, certainly the bar has been raised, at least temporarily, for like next generation biofuels. We'd say that we're probably at a place where at scale, you're talking about, say, $2.50 for a gallon of cellulosic ethanol. You scale that for the energy content, let's call it $3 per gallon of gasoline equivalent. Well, today, that wholesale price is $1 because of the oil price drop. So clearly it affects there. But on the other hand, putting aside 2017 really opened up discussion again, CAFE standards are still going to be there. So getting very efficient vehicles and all the technologies it takes to have a vehicle that's 55 miles per gallon and satisfying customer needs or desires is still there. So certainly at DOE on oil, and I'm just going to be now kind of just narrow down to the United States. The fact is we still import 7 million barrels a day of crude oil. So certainly on our side, we are not taking our eye off the ball at all in terms of more efficient vehicles, in terms of alternative fuels next generation biofuels, for example, and in terms of electrification of vehicles. So we will keep pushing hard on those. You know, in terms of surprise, this is just reminded, you know, if you think in terms of surprise, I gotta believe that almost everybody in this room, I'm certainly among them, has been surprised at how fast something like driverless vehicles have come at us. It's not that they don't have a lot of challenges yet, including, you know, liability issues and all kinds of questions, but it's kind of amazing. And there's an example of something, if it should be a large penetration, it's clearly it's certainly going to be an electric vehicle, probably, you know, I mean, very valuable in an urban environment, and it's a game changer. It really gives you a new service, basically.
What would you say to, let's say, a Republican member of Congress who made precisely that argument, that we never really know which innovations are going to be decisive. We always end up being surprised. And if these technologies, these energy-saving technologies, you know, solar, wind, et cetera, if they're as good as you say, Mr. Secretary, why don't we let the market allocate funds to them and let them make their way on their own without ARPA-E, without that kind of support? What's the way in which you'd respond to that argument?
Well, because we touched on it earlier. I think it's very hard to argue that the marketplace invests particularly in kind of earlier stage. I mean, there is some of that. I mean, in the investment world, but by and large, you're going to find in universities and labs people trying new hard things that maybe initially don't have the cost test applied to them, but to scale in this business will eventually have to meet that cost test, and that takes a long time. Often takes a lot of capital, and often requires the integration of multiple technologies. You know, look, IT in the energy business, in my view, is still in the very early stages of really being taken maximum advantage of. We have a long way to go there.
So a question that has nothing to do with ARPA-E, but I've wondered often, maybe others in the audience have. You're in the final year of your tenure as Energy Secretary with this administration, and I'm wondering, quite apart from whether you might be asked by whoever is the next president to stay on, what you're going to do after this amazing experience. Are you going to go back to teaching physics at MIT? Are you going to go out and start a company and exploit new technology ideas? What do you think about when you think about the future?
I thought you and I would write a spy novel.
With pleasure. Your advance will be a lot larger than mine. Well, I'm sure you can do better than that. And I do want to just.
I consider myself an agent of innocence.
Well, the secretary just plugged my first novel. Right. I'm happy to sell copies of it afterwards. But so you don't. One of the experiences that you had that had nothing to do with ARPA-E was being a central figure in the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear program. I wonder whether that's going to be a continuing interest for you, and I also wonder whether you ever had a conversation with your Iranian counterpart, Salehi, about solar energy, wind energy, alternative sources, whether the Iranians, with all their oil, are thinking about getting into the alternative energy business.
He certainly is. Yes, we did have those discussions, you know, in the after negotiating sessions, et cetera. No, they're very interested in alternatives. Now, Mr. Salehi, in particular, is interested in novel nuclear technologies, given his background. But also, we talked about renewables, and also, by the way, about water, energy and water. In Iran, there's some pretty serious drought in part of the country. So we talked about that for sure. And in terms of, you know, the future, just to be slightly less ambitious, than writing a spy novel with you. No, but I think, look, the two things that I have, frankly, have worked on for a long, long time will remain one way or another, the passion, and that is addressing climate, particularly, and for me, through technology innovation. And secondly, to use the standard phrase, reducing the nuclear danger, staying involved in trying to eliminate the risks of nuclear materials, and regrettably, there still are quite a few of those.
So on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank Secretary Moniz. We often hear conversations in this political season about whether America is leading the world in the way that it should, but certainly last November, December, watching the events in Paris, you couldn't help but think that the United States was at the center of something really important, and as you've told us, something that will endure regardless of what happens over the next few months.
I think we're winning the public argument.
So, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for joining us and a good conversation.
Thank you, David.